And we're live.
Yay!
Welcome back.
Welcome,
So,
friends.
yes, friends all. So, we're going to just hang out for a couple minutes while we let people find the stream on Facebook and find the stream on YouTube and find the streams and all the
Find all the
places.
streams. Cross the streams.
Oh, don't do that. I hear that's bad.
Well, sometimes it could cause feedback, but it depends on who's crossing the stream and where.
That's fair. All
Yes.
right. So, I am marking us as an announcement
Yay.
in the gather group to help people find us.
Sacred space time, guys. We're gonna talk about sacred space. Draw the flower.
Yeah. Yes, hello. I have stolen Michelle's naughty elf hat because that's what I do. Ooh.
Adorable.
Oh, I see what you're doing. So there's like multiples of you, and you need them all in there so that you can have a good audio, right?
Yes.
I got you. I won't take your important pieces out then. All right.
So
Yeah.
let me know when you think we're good to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I think we're getting right there.
We're right there.
Yeah.
So let's get
Well,
started,
let me see.
friends.
All right. This is our marvelous Abri. She will be guiding you through this class on sacred space.
Sacred
And
space.
I am going to pop my naughty face out of here until. Um,
Naughty times.
actually, I've got a question for you, Abri, before I go.
What's up?
Do you want me to pop back in as people have questions, or wait until you've gotten through like a bunch of presentation-y stuff?
As we go, you can pop in with questions. I think
All
that'd
right.
be good. Yeah.
Great. I will pop in and out when people ask questions.
Yeah, I love it.
All right. Bye for now.
Goodbye for now. And hello to all of you. So again, hello. My name is Abri, or Kat, but we'll go for Abri for now. And we're going to have a class tonight on sacred space. And what's really fun about this sacred space is if you were participating in our opening ritual, you've now participated in one form of sacred space. And I'm going to explain kind of like the Keprian ideas of sacred space, but also like the general senses of sacred space. It's a very huge topic, and there's a lot to it. And I'm not going to be able to cover everything. But if you have questions, by all means, please ask, because then I can address your questions. So let's get started. So, what is a sacred space? How do we define a sacred space? So, what did I post on? There we go. A sacred space is a space that we do sacred work within. I think that's the most general sense of that definition. There's generally a defined edge to the space. There's a purpose for that space. It can be physical, it cannot be physical. There's many layers to what it is, but generally speaking, something sacred will be done in that space. In Keprian ritual, we begin, our warriors move into the space and they cleanse that space and they set up the foundation. They ground it, but they also create the bedrock for everything to be built on top of it. This is part of the definition of the space, and it delineates a clear and intentional boundary, which is important when dealing with spaces in which you're going to be doing a lot of energetic work. A lot of that as well, like within the Keprian system, the counselors come in and start to weave those connections. And if you did the opening ritual, you saw how that was done, or at least heard how that was done, experienced how that was done. And all of that networking and building together, and all of those energetic resources are connected and geared up, so when the priests come in, the structure can be made and the intent and the will can go forward. We defined our sacred space with our will. I think fundamentally, you can do a lot with just your will, with your desire for it to become a thing. You put intention into a space and make it something greater than it was before. You can set the boundaries of a sacred space with your physical actions or visualizations. And many neo-pagan practices use oftentimes like a walking of a circle, and in Christian practices, there's a whole building dedicated, like that's its dedicated space, and it's built through ritual and community. And this goes far beyond just those two examples. We can find sacred space in nature. You can be walking through the woods and find a place that just speaks to you. It feels almost like it is a cathedral in its own right. It is a naturally occurring sacred space. And then you can also create interior or astral sacred spaces, which is something that we did for our opening ritual. So long as the space is defined and within the will and with intention, you can consider it a type of sacred space. And it can be further defined by the type of work that you're going to be doing within it. So one of the types of sacred spaces I want to talk about is organic sacred spaces. And the organic sacred space can be defined as a natural or fluid space, like I just mentioned. Walking into that natural space, you feel a subtle shift in the energy. The light seems to be like hitting just the right places. There's a sense of awe or reverence in the space. It is a naturally occurring space that you feel that something can be done here, or nature is trying to show you something magical there. Um, Wild spaces are most notable for this, but we can create organic structures too by paying attention to the flow of the environment, like a garden. A lot of times, really beautiful gardens can become a well-intentioned, almost temple to nature, and they have their own power within them. There's a flow to the energy within them. And that space can be defined and will by I enter this space to calm myself, or I enter this space to connect to nature. And so at that point, it does become sacred. Um, Another type of sacred space, and I think one we're more familiar with, is structured sacred space. Intentionally structured space are formed around logical geometries with a clear order of the space. Examples of this are temples, buildings, altars. Those are prime examples of that. These spaces are created and imposed into a space both in permanent and portable instances. And I'll go more into that later as well. So we do have organic and we have structured. Uh, a lot of sacred spaces include some form of geometry. And this is a place that I really enjoy, and I challenge you, if you're in a place where you have an altar perhaps set up in your home, or if you visit a temple or a church, to think about it for a second, because there's sneakily a geometry there. Um, the geometries and patterns will pop up with intention, usually with a focal point uh, or a need. So sometimes you'll have like an amphitheater set up where it's like a half circle or a semicircle where all the focus is directed into one spot. So you could almost say that it has a triangular, but also cyclical nature to it, intentioned to bring all the attention forward, but also everybody's connected in that cyclical, circular manner. My altar upstairs, for instance, has different types of things going on with it, where many things are put in place to bring focus to one direct place. And it's this low-key geometry that helps us make a hierarchy of how things feed into the whole purpose of that space, whether it be ritual work, will work, or deity worship. I think another really good example of geometries in sacred space are mandalas. And Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism specifically, the mandala is this beautiful geometric pattern, which isn't just a pattern. It itself is a sacred space. It has a defined edge, and within it is a temple. And as you meditate with that space, as you enter into that space, you are moving through that temple. And as you journey through that temple, you can find all manner of information. And I'll discuss more of that later on in this discussion as well. But I did want to touch on that, that mandalas have a very important geometrical quality to them and lend to that idea of geometry both in and outside of sacred space. Another aspect of sacred space that is important to note is setting of permissions within structured sacred space. And this is really helpful for a couple of reasons. So say you have a space and a setup in your house that you want to do work with disembodied or ghosts or entities and spirits, but you don't want them to have free reign of your home. You can essentially set up your sacred space as a welcoming place for them. But that boundary is important because you can give them permissions. You are allowed in this sacred space, but you are not allowed outside of that sacred space. And those permissions are really helpful in defining that space and to make it more rich and to give it purpose. And it helps for you to reinforce that boundary as well. You're welcome here, and we'll do this work in this space, and this is why it's important. There's also a fun thing about sacred space when you consider how flexible it can be. I think we've all heard that phrase, your body's a temple. And when you're talking about sacred space and the self, it is. So you can create within yourself a sacred space. And it's completely private. It's only for you if you want it to be. You can make it look like anything you'd like it to make. You can meditate and build on that over and over again with that repetitious nature of building up that space until it is rich and vibrant and is almost as solid as reality itself if you want it to. And within that space, you have the ability to move about and do the work you would love to do. This is a really, really great way of maintaining a sacred space, maintaining your altars, maintaining everything you need to do in practice without actually physically having to represent it. It's really good if you're in a position where you don't have the ability to build an altar. For instance, when I was in college, I didn't have space to have an altar. I didn't have the setup that I would prefer to have that altar, so I kept it within myself. I could access it at any point, and it was always there. And it was very helpful for me to use that as my practice because no matter where I went, I always had that space. That space is also similar to the astral space, which is what we participated in for opening ritual. The astral sacred space is built similarly to how we do the self-sacred space, with the change of we are now engaging with many, many more people. And we build that sacred space together. It is an active and engaging sacred space so that everybody brings something new to the table. Everybody brings some new layer to that creation of a temple space, for instance, that we can all participate in. With repetition, if you do this sort of building and participating in this astral space over and over again, it becomes more solid over time, and you can access it and actually interact with people on that, like within the space there. The great thing about astral as well is, unlike a physical space, it's no matter what happens, it will always be there for you, and you can always access it. We have a question, Illyria?
We do. So the question is, in setting up these spaces, do you think it's better to hold the space yourself or to create wards or servitors to hold the space for you?
So, fun you should ask. You can do both. And it's really about what your intention is with that space. If you're going to be doing a lot of really specific energy where you don't want interference, then you can make that perimeter something strong. And when you start making that perimeter, you can use warding, you can use salt, you can use whatever you need to reinforce in your mind that this is a barrier, a hard barrier that nothing can enter and nothing can exit unless your will says otherwise. For instance, you don't want to make your sacred space so encapsulated and impenetrable that the work that you're doing, if it needs to leave that space, can leave it. You want to have an opening available to it to allow it to escape. I often don't use wards all that often for ritual work, but I will use wards for areas within my house that I want to allow spirits in and out of. They are not allowed in certain parts of my home, and the places that they are not allowed, I ward. Now, warding in sacred space, when you go back and forth, like I said, is really about intention. And if you have a sacred space where you don't want certain types of entities to enter into, you can design a ward and ward against that particular type of entity. I don't want this coming in, or I don't want this type of energy to enter. Within Keprian structure, our warriors do that for us. They're consciously doing that. They're maintaining that barrier. They're keeping stuff out, and they're keeping what we're doing within. So like I said, a lot of that comes back down to will and how we want to approach those barriers and boundaries. A lot of times I don't have very firm, hard boundaries when I'm doing something unless it's very particular. That's why when it comes to sacred space permissions, it's something to consider. If you're going to be doing ancestor work, for instance, and it's just you and them, and you don't want anything to interact between that, then you can set a very firm boundary. That's the limit. That's all I want. But if you have an altar space that you are more flexible and it's more like a working space, you don't know necessarily what you're going to be working with. So sometimes it might be good to keep the barriers more along the lines of to keep distractions out, or to keep unnecessary ambient energy, things like that out. But to have the flexibility to, but I need some of that right now, and to allow that in. I like to approach boundaries within a sacred space as like internet permissions. I revoke your permissions for this, but I will grant them for this. And I can change them fluidly. And I think that's important to be able to adapt to what you need it to be. They can be firm, and that firmness is that reinforcement, like a ward. You would continue to re-up your wards, once a week, once a month, whatever you need to do. You can do that. But me personally, I like a fluid space. Um, so moving into, I want to go into a little bit of details about permanent and portable sacred spaces. So we have permanent and portable. All right. So permanent sacred spaces, I think, is something we're all more or less familiar with. This will include things like altars. It will also include temples, buildings, rooms, chambers. Pretty sure all of these are synonyms, more or less. And portable sacred space is going to fall into the astral, the inner self, and something I like to call matchbox shrines, which I'll get into, and ritual space, like in an event. So we'll do ritual event space. All right. I'll also tack on mandalas here, which I'll get into again later. So when it comes to altars, so we'll focus here on the altar spaces. They're usually small spaces that take up portions of the room. Like, you know what an altar is. They're there for the intention of either giving sacrifices or ritual workings, honoring ancestors or spirits or entities. They come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, designs, and structures. The best thing about an altar is its customization. It can be very flexible, or it can be very solid. The biggest thing about an altar that I would think that needs to be in place is generally some sort of focus, because you're directing your thought and your will towards something. Many altars have a set focus, and while they can be physically changed as far as like the items, so say you have a seasonal altar that you change out for like spring, summer, fall, winter, typically the things that go into feed into that purpose of that altar, there's still going to be something there that's going to be your focus, even if it's just a general space, like the workspace. For instance, if you have an altar like this, and this is where you're sitting, you have a lot of your like decor. Let's say it's like flowers and leaves and things that change periodically, but maybe you have like 2 statues, 2 candles, and this workplace. So in this altar setup, you have all of these shapes feeding into that workspace and to you, so you become part of it. So you get this geometry of you and them, like that. You can imbue that space with repetition and with the practice of it, and it's going to keep building, and it becomes very physical, so much so that you can approach an altar, even if it's not your own altar. Like down here, there's a Marie Laveau altar in one of the shops, and you walk into it, and there's this real rich sense of how many people and places and things that have been put onto that altar, and there's a really incredible sense of being within it. It's a powerful structure in its own right. Altars are also good because they have a built-in boundary. So they have this like nice shelf or workspace that's there in front of you, and you access that. So you are the being that is penetrating the boundary, and you're allowed to penetrate that boundary. What I do in my altar space is I actually have the boundary of that altar space a little bit larger so that I feel that the structure stays more stable. That's personal for me. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Mm. So the other type, let's talk about temple spaces for a second. Usually they're dedicated buildings, and these spaces host several to many people and such. The space is built within the shared experience of those who use the space. So rather than the building itself being important, it is the community that builds the space. And I think that's the biggest defining feature between something that's more private, like an altar, which doesn't have to be, it can actually be, community driven as well. But temples, buildings, rooms, chambers generally are more than one person are interacting with them. Um, they often have a primary worshiping room or space, and then they have other areas that might have distinct other focuses but are still tied into that main space. Uh, some temple structures, some rooms, churches, what have you, will have this distinct feeling when you walk through the door because so many bodies have passed through and have sat there and given their worship or given their intent and will for something that it is almost tangible. Uh, you can enter into some of these spaces and you can definitely tell what the mood of the intent is. Like, does it feel joyous or does it feel solemn, respectful? You can't deny when you walk into a space like that that you bodily feel something different. You feel a change. Uh, and sometimes when you don't feel that change in a space, maybe you just don't resonate with that energy. But it's usually there because everybody who participates in that temple is doing so with the intent to be there. The designs of buildings and structures generally, again, are very similar to like an upscaled altar where you'll have a focus and then you'll have, say, seating like this. This is just an example where the attention and will and from all the participants come in and make this shape so that everybody's focus is here for the person who, let's say, is speaking or is doing a rite or ritual, and then that can go up. Differently, when it's circular, you can have English setups where you have somebody in the center and people are around the edges, in points even, where the direction of that energy is flowing to one person, and then the will can come out. It's flexible. It's you're building always on it. It can take almost any shape you want. But within a temple structure, generally, it's like I said, the building itself becomes that reinforcement of the shape of the energy.
Hello there.
Hello, welcome back.
Oh, thanks. We've got a couple more questions.
Gimme.
All right. So, can you offer some tips on how to go about creating a portable sacred space?
We're just about to get into that.
Oh,
That's
perfect.
next. Yes.
Oh, do you want me to ask the other one now, or just
Yes, please.
Okay. So, if wards and protections were left behind in a space,
Mhm.
can you safely dismantle those which are no longer serving your purpose, or like scoop up the ones that are there if they do serve your purpose?
If you didn't have the words in place to begin with?
No. So the way I'm reading this is if you came into a new space, like if you moved apartments
Mhm.
and you perceived that there were wards and protections already there,
Mhm.
would it be safe, acceptable to dismantle the ones you didn't want and just keep the ones you did?
Yeah. I mean, so when I moved into our apartment previously, we had some spots of the home that felt like somebody had done something before, and that's what I did. One of them was kind of hard to undo, and its purpose was to keep everything out, which is not that's not what I wanted. So I let it sit for a couple weeks because they'll naturally degrade over time to the point where I could start dismantling it. and then start from a clean slate. If you're moving homes, I like the clean slate. I don't It's like buying a house. You don't know who did the electrical or, who did the plumbing. If you have the ability to get rid of all of that stuff and build your own so that you know how it's functioning and working, that's the best option in my opinion. Is clear it all out and start from square one. But I'm OCD about how I interact with things as such. So if you encounter a word that you like and you understand how it's functioning and you want it there, just keep reinforcing. I don't see any problem with that.
Yeah. And like where I'm more of a, ooh, did these people who used to live here leave me some furniture? Sweet.
Yeah.
I'll take it. Like I would totally adapt that stuff
Mm-hmm.
to my purposes if I liked it. And if I
Yeah.
did, I get rid of it.
If it works for you, keep it. If it works with you, keep it. But if it's a pesky thing in the corner that's causing you a problem, get rid of it.
Awesome.
You don't need that in your life.
All right. I will pop out and let you continue on.
Yes, you're welcome. So, surprise, we're going straight into portable sacred space. It was literally the next thing on the list, so we get to answer some fun questions. Portable sacred space comes, like I said, I have like 3 or 4 general ideas of what I consider portable sacred space. There's the astral and inner sacred space, something I like to call matchbox shrines, and mandalas. So we've talked a little bit about the astral and the inner set, like the self space. I'm going to touch on matchbox shrines because it's something that I don't often hear or come across, and I'd like to share that first because I think it's something interesting and useful for a couple of reasons. Also, they can tie into astral space, so I'm all for them. A matchbox shrine, I believe, started, I want to say in the 80s, early 90s, maybe before that even. But I learned about matchbox shrines from my art teacher in high school. And these were generally done as small ways of having shrines that you could keep hidden. They were in quite literally a matchbox, and you could like slide them open. And inside the matchbox, you would decorate the interior with the figure of your worship, symbols, colors. A lot of the things she did was collage, so a lot of them were full of collages of like sayings and prayers and different things that she had placed inside them, painted them. And then within that space, within that background of this box, you would have a figure that you could put in, or for example, of something you could do. So we have this box, and it's all colorfully painted in there. And then you could have something like a figurine that you glue to one side, and you could hang and decorate everything within this little box. And once you are finished with it, you can just slide it, like a matchbox. You just slide it back out, or you can do it in a cigar box. I prefer cigar boxes for this. They're a little bigger, but they work just as well because matchboxes these days are cardboard. I like to use the wood, the old matchboxes, the slidey ones. So you would build this with intent and purpose, and you would have this matchbox. And you can energy work this matchbox for a couple of things. It can become a microcosm of an altar space and temple in its own right. All within this space are all the things you would need to do your practice and your ritual work, just on a smaller scale. But the gloriousness of energy work is the scale sometimes doesn't really matter. It's the intent and the power behind it. So if you had things in that box that are very powerful representations of things that you're working with, they're just as powerful this big than they are, this big. Another use I like for matchbox shrines is because of the space and because of the boundaries that you set, you can like ward the outside so that nothing can penetrate within that ward. If they're hidden, they're portable, they're really great for that. But they can also work as doors. And I like to use them as doors to other sacred spaces. So for instance, same matchbox idea, same small box. And say you participate in our HK connection rituals every Saturday. What if you wanted to help yourself have a focus in front of you that helps you connect to that space better or faster or more strong? You wanted to build a focus for yourself to make that connection go pop right when you wanted it to. And then also enter that space maybe outside of the connection ritual. Return to that space periodically and engage in it. Well, you can build a door. And I really like this idea for, especially with our connection ritual stuff, because you can put in it something like, House Keperu. You can have a symbol or a sigil. If I were to build one of these, I would use the symbol, let's just say for our 2020 gather symbol. It's perfect circle, bloop right in the center. You can put rocks or crystals, things that help make you think about stabilizing your energy or boosting your energy or establishing stronger connections. And so you decorate that whole box with that interior focus. You want something right in the center for you to focus on. Alternatively, maybe not put that symbol. You could just paint a black sphere in that bottom. And that's where you aim your focus. So you'd put your candle kind of like behind it safely. You don't want nothing to burn. And then put that matchbox right in front of it so that as you're sitting, say like this, you have your little box. And then back here, you have a candle at an appropriate height. Just, so nothing's burning. And then you're looking here while that ambient light's behind it as an access point. That is your focus and your door to an astral space. That's another way of using them. The matchbox shrines themselves, as their own sacred space, can also be areas where you hold tools for ritual space that you can do in a community. So everything kind of stays compact and sacred within that box. And once the box is opened, it's like a tent almost. It unfolds the space within it. It takes a lot of repetition and a lot of working with this box in order to get it to kind of function like that for you, but it absolutely can and can define that space for you. You pull like your tools out of it, candles or incense, however you want to go about building your space and using that box as a focus point as well. If we move back into astral and inner sacred spaces, those are built mostly with our imagination, meditation, repetition. And they can take any kind of form and they can be there for any sort of purpose. You can access it from anywhere and you don't have to worry about it being destroyed. Or no coaching be like, oh, you need to move apartments, you need to take down your altar. No, you don't have to do that. It's already there. It's already set up. The difficult thing I think that happens with astral and inner spaces is if you're not engaging them regularly, they start to fade. It's a little bit of that if you lose it, if you don't use it, you lose it sort of scenario. So you definitely want to make sure that you're engaging in that space and building on it, not only to maintain it, but you can expand it. They don't necessarily always just disappear on you, but accessing it can get a little hazy with time. There's a quote about mandalas. So mandalas themselves are similar to a matchbox shrine in some ways, but very different in others. So here's a quote about Buddhism and matchbox shrines that I enjoyed. The mandala represents an imaginary place that is contemplated during meditation. Each object in the palace has significance, representing an aspect of wisdom or reminding the meditator of a guiding principle. The mandala's purpose is to help transform ordinary minds into enlightened ones and to assist with healing. So they're using sacred space and inner space kind of interchangeably, using a visual representation of that space, which you can absolutely do. Something that I like to do as well is if there is a particular space that I want to continue accessing, I will draw it. I will try and create it the best I can. I think if I couldn't draw, if I wasn't confident in my drawing skills, I might even try to build it with like popsicle sticks or anything, just sort of create that space. I think that's a really great way of giving a physical focus to your work with astral temples and astral spaces, especially astral sacred spaces, because sometimes we need that little bit of physical reinforcement to help us keep it solid. Hello again.
Oh, hello. We've got a question for you.
Yes, gimme.
Is it possible to aim one of those doors that you described to a loved one who has passed on? Or would that be rude or not possible?
Aim that door. Oh, like if you're trying to access the loved one.
Yeah. Like can you target specific entities, whether a loved one or some other?
like ritual work, I think that if you had so if I wanted to build a matchbox to my grandmother, I could use it for that. I can have, and like a door, you can open a door, but it's up to them to come to you. You're not targeting them and like twisting their arm, be like, Grandma, talk to me. That's not what you're doing. You could absolutely use that as a doorway to engage with them specifically and have that as your boundary and intent and ritual space. But it's an invitation, especially with disembodied spirits. Like, and that's how I approach working with disembodied as far as like ancestor spirits are concerned. Especially with loved ones. Forcing a being into a ritual space is a whole other ball of wax. That takes a lot of really specific things and something I don't really want to get into for this particular stream because it can be very complex and subjective to the nth degree. There's so much that goes into like forcing an entity into a space that there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had about consent and why you're doing it and what the purpose is. For talking to somebody who's gone, make a door and invite them to the door. And if they're ready to speak or if they want to speak, they'll come. And sometimes they might be speaking to you already, but you just haven't heard them yet. And that's often the case. So yeah, you can use it for that.
You've got another question.
Yeah, gimme.
All right, here we come. What are some of your thoughts on virtual sacred spaces?
They are just as applicable as everything else we've discussed.
I was actually going to say, like, with the exception of, well, maybe not with any exceptions, but I feel like many of our sacred spaces only exist in a virtual sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of ritual space and a temple. I mean, as Michelle was talking about in the opening ritual, we can all go there without being physically there.
Yep. So here's a fun twisty thing. There was a game that I played called Rift, and within that Rift you had a dimension, and in that dimension you could build whatever you wanted. So it would be a fun thing to try to build a sacred space, an actual virtual temple, and invite people inside that temple to practice. Because I believe what happens is you create an avatar of yourself that you are engaging with, and then that point engages further. So you could absolutely build something within a virtual space as a temple for a particular purpose. So long, I believe, as your will and your intent is remaining strong and you're not being distracted by the virtualness of the world, like, ooh, there's a cool particle effect on this shiny thing over here. If that's distracting you and not helping you feel immersed in that space, then it needs to go. Or you need to refocus your mind and strengthen your will and your purpose and mission. Absolutely, like, I believe that you can do that and engage with that. And I feel like I have when I was in that space, because I would build a sacred space for a particular purpose. And then as I'm walking through it, be like, yes. And then I could engage or have, work with past life memories. I did a lot of work with that virtual sacred space to good effect. Like, I had a lot of good engagement and process of coming to discover certain things about myself using a virtual temple. Absolutely can do that.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to pop back out to
Okie dokie.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. All right. Our next portable sacred space is the group ritual space, which, if you've gone to a past gather, you've experienced. It's portable, and it also has a bookend. It has a beginning and an end. The space doesn't persist. Oftentimes, those sorts of sacred spaces are very unique because they are a snapshot in time of a particular group of people at a particular place in time, at a particular moment in this world story that we're living. Group sacred space, ritual space that we create and craft at Gather is a space that's there to align us. Its purpose is to make sure that we're all connected and on a similar level so that we can engage with each other and the space and the work that we're doing in a manner that keeps us all even and moving towards our purposes. It also helps to unite us all and makes us feel more cozy together in the work that we're doing, even if we've never met people. The great thing about, say, a Gather sacred space is within that space, you're open to engage in other people because their intention is similar to yours. That was the whole purpose of that ritual, is to unite us and align us in a manner that we can speak freely. We can go in and discuss what we need to discuss. We can be vulnerable and talk about things that we don't talk about in our everyday lives with other people who are doing the exact same thing. That's why this sort of group ritual space, this group sacred space, is so important. And as the weekend continues to go forward, that opening ritual space, that visualization you had in your mind, or that experience that you had, is still there. It's still present. It's up and it's running, and you can be there in an instant if you wish. And as the weekend goes on, I encourage you to keep entering into that space, remembering the feeling of that first ritual, and to get into it again, and to feel it and experience it and keep it strong and keep it vibrant. And as we all participate in it, it's going to change and transform the experiences we all have, because that space is in with each and every one of us. And it's also in that removed place, that astral place as well. It's very interesting, kind of brain trippy, and I absolutely love it. So play with it, go there, experiment. If you're going to experiment, please ask consent. If you're going to be targeting certain people for things, it's more fun, honestly, if you do, because then if you're doing some cool energy stuff, then you can all take notes and like go back and forth and see if you were all experiencing similar things, or if the effect that you were doing is being felt, that sort of thing. And then the last big topic of the night for me is how to use your sacred space. There is so many ways you could use a sacred space that it is almost impossible to discuss, but I'm going to talk on a few biggies. I talked about doing ritual work with it. So if you're somebody who likes to craft spells, or if you like to put intentions into objects to use, like say necklaces or jewelry, that sort of stuff, you can use your sacred space to help you make those items more powerful, make those spells more poignant. Um, you can use sacred space for deity worship. You can use sacred space for shadow work, which is something that as a Caprian I like to do often and a lot. I will go into my sacred space and use it as a place that dims the rest of the world around me, so that when I focus inward, I'm not distracted. And I can keep digging deeper and deeper into why I do the things I do. Is how I see the world around me truly informed? Like, do I need to change my perspectives? I like to use that space to help me focus in on that particular, need, which is shadow work. I'd love to get in more shadow work. We have plenty of space outside of this class to discuss, about shadow work and things like that. So if you see any of the Caprian hangout times and you have questions about that, feel free to ask any one of us. We'll be happily to answer to all of your shadow work questions, because it's a topic that I believe most of us are very enthused about. But that being said, you can absolutely use your sacred space as a place to engage with your shadow work in a very meaningful way, especially if you're writing or journaling. Like, your journal can stay in that sacred space. The tools you need for it are there. Someplace comfortable where you can get relaxed and meditate. All of that builds into that inner looking that you're going to be doing. Sacred space is, like I said, a huge topic. So if you have any questions or ideas, anything like that, we're pretty much wrapping up the end of this class. So I'm going to open the floor out for discussions and questions and anything else you might have that you would like to discuss, ideas and more. Really what it comes down to is sacred space is what you make of it. So long as you have a strong intention and you have a knowledge of how you want to define that space, it's sky's the limit. Be creative, be crazy with it. Like, define all those pieces, layer it up. What you're really doing is strengthening your will by using that space, and using that space to help you create change in the world.
Awesome.
Yeah, hello.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Hey, sweet.
Yeah.
Well, ooh, I wonder if we can do a new. Whoa, that's weird. Maybe not that.
Sorry.
No.
Well,
I'm just gonna pop everything all around. That's usually what I do to you. But yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Abri.
I like the matchbox shrine.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like that is a really cool concept and like a good shorthand.
Mhm.
I want to do that thing that I promised myself I would do. Abri,
Yes.
people want to find out more about what you do. And if people want to support you in what you do, where can they find you on the internet?
Well, I have a website and I do energy body drawings. And they're sessions, so I have them on Skype, so you don't have to come to New Orleans to have them done or go to gather. It can happen almost any time, any place, so long as you have either a phone or an internet connection. I prefer using Skype because you can watch me draw as I'm doing it. It's very helpful so that you can see the colors and things. If you have questions, I can go in and show you specifically what's happening with this or that.
And that website is
aetherbody.com.
AE.
AETHERBODY.com.
Perfect.
And you'll see a little button at the top of the screen. It says book appointment. And it's as easy as that.
That's lovely. And look at this. While we were talking, a couple of folks came up with similar questions.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Can you talk a bit about a strongly remembered sacred space you experienced or encountered? Thoughts on that?
I have good thoughts on that. So remember that virtual world I was discussing? I built a temple around my sacred space that I remembered from a past life memory. And it was so vivid and so visual that I was able to recreate it in a virtual place. And in doing that, it actually helped me process a lot of that past life memory and to engage with it. So in a way, my sacred space became the intention of helping me delve into past lives.
Yeah,
that's what I used it for.
The fun part about that was like going into this space and going, Abri, did you mean to make this look like this thing?
Yep. And it was like, oh, wait, there's more. And then you open the door and you're like, oh my gosh. There's so many layers to this. Different times and places. It was pretty fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I will say, like, actually, for me, part of the priest role, when I'm visualizing the temple and standing, like the part that I bring forward are temples from my past that I have a strong resonance with. So I know when one of the tricks as standing as priest in ritual is not forcing your temple on everybody else, but bringing it as an aspect.
Yeah, merging it.
Yeah, and then letting it sort of like bleed over on the edges to everything else. But I've definitely found that a lot of folks who bring temples forward, it's often something that they served in a long time ago. And if not, then it's what they've dedicated themselves to currently.
Yeah, I like to see when it comes to priests and their temples that you are, if it's a circle and you're part of that circle, let's say down here, you are the doorway into your temple is how I like to visualize it. So if you were to look at somebody, behind them is their temple. And like it's sort of like you said, merges with everybody else, but it's almost like an alcove of a snapshot in time is how I usually visualize it. But it's the same thing.
Debs has a really good
No,
one.
I know. I'm trying to see if I can paraphrase it all. I'm just going to read this one.
Yeah. So, go for it.
So ethically, if you have sacred space that you use for working with people, but someone is not open to the concepts, is that okay? How do you work around consent or intent when you have an energetic sacred space?
Is it like somebody who lives with you, for instance?
There aren't more details given for that. I'm not sure if it's someone who's physically present, even who's in a body.
I actually, Abri, some of your experiences with your husband might speak to that a little bit.
So my beautiful, amazing husband is Muggle, I guess. He's not into this stuff. And for a long time, I respected that and kept our spaces pretty much separate. But he's always been aware of, that's a woogity thing over there. And he knows that that's my thing and I'm doing that. And he really, doesn't engage with it. I didn't necessarily ask for his consent about that because it was a shared space. But he was aware of it, and should he have brought up that he had a problem with it, we would have discussed it and done something about it that would make him more comfortable. Um,
It's an interesting question because for me, like, energy work or magic requires consent when you're doing it to another person.
yes.
But we exist in spaces all the time, and we don't require consent because we switch the furniture around or because
Right.
we've got like a certain scent going.
Mhm.
Um, if the person expresses, I'm not comfortable with that, but if it's shared space, I have a hard time. This is one of the few places where I'm like, I'm not sure that,
It's tricky.
yeah, that consent is something that I would, that's a wibbly space for consent for me.
Yeah. Like I would approach it as like, let's say this, if I lived with a bunch of people and we
Mm.
had a communal space, I wouldn't be doing that sort of work in that communal space
Yeah.
unless I absolutely had to. If there was a place within the home that, let's say, was distinctly my own, at that point, that is my space to do that kind of work in.
But
But
words and shields and boundaries have an impact on this.
mhm,
And like part of my setting sacred space in any place that I live is establishing those
yes,
those boundaries and things. And again, that seems like a passive impact. Like it's not uh, me targeting a single person; it's targeting the space in which we interact. And so it falls for me, at least personally, more in the sense of like ambient feeding as a
mhm,
vampire, where you're taking stuff, but not from any direct person. It's just sort of the free floating energy.
yeah. I
It,
mean, like, mm, so uh, let's say, like, if I'm at my mom's house and like everything's very Catholic flavored,
hmm,
and let's say that didn't work with me, and I entered that space and I had a problem with how it felt, then I could see where this question becomes like problematic.
hmm.
Like if I had a reaction to like just even walking through the door and it being uncomfortable.
Or if you're setting it up specifically to make somebody uncomfortable.
Right.
But if you're
Right.
setting it up to make yourself comfortable, that's, in my opinion, part of living in a space.
Yes. Yeah, that should be accounted for. But that's
Yeah.
why I feel like the consent comes down to talking to the people who are within the space. So if they are uncomfortable with, say, symbols that you hang up, you don't really need to have the symbols in that communal space. You
Hmm.
can have it someplace more private, but the wording and stuff I would still put up because it's effectively doing the same thing.
Well, and like the Matchbox Shrine is neat because I see that as being really useful if you have a practice that you have to hide, you're obligated to
Yes.
hide.
And that's why I like those
Yeah.
because you can hide them. They can be not just a matchbox, but you can uh, commit, book travesty of hollowing out a book and like putting it within that so you can hide it on your bookshelf and no one would know. If you have to be covert about your practice, like there are a lot of really great ways of doing that by using that matchbox shrine technique. And that way it can be portable. You don't have to worry about, people fussing at you about having stuff around or making them uncomfortable or however.
I would imagine like some of those craft boxes at like
Mhm.
Michael's or like a cleverly disguised jewelry box or something, like something you open.
Yes. So one of the ones I used to have when I was little, because we did some like with my family practice, we had our family stuff kind of built into jewelry boxes because we hung cornicelli necklaces. What are these little horns? They're little spiral horns made out of coral.
Mm.
But you would open the top and it was one of those that like folded out. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so it had different aspects to it, like different family members were represented by different levels, and it was this whole thing. But you can be super creative. Like I love the creativity and creating your own space. And it doesn't have to be an altar or a room, or you don't have to necessarily have symbols everywhere. So long as you have that one space that you can create, even if it's a matchbox, that's your
Yeah.
doorway to where you need to work.
Growing up, I had a little locket that was a Bible. Being Catholic, raised Catholic, but it was like, mother of pearl and emerald and everything. And I could see even something like that, something that small.
Small, yeah.
It was meant to have like little Bible verses and stuff in it, and like
Yeah.
a little bit of like chrism and frankincense.
But like in fairy lore, if you looked through a ring and a rock, you could see the realm. And like you can get really creative about how you access that sacred space.
There's a neat question about could the matchbox be used to hold a fixed pattern of different crystals to create something like a portable energetic filter or Reiki work effects, or like a matrix, and I could totally see it for that.
Yeah, you can definitely do it with
You
that.
can just dunk whatever in there and just have your little thing that you can carry around.
Yeah, you can mount them on the sides if you want to make it to where it makes like a pyramid or something inside. Yeah, you can, like I said, be creative with them because they are a really open canvas to be built on whatever you need them to be. Sky's the limit. That's why I like them.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, if folks don't have too many more questions, we're going to take a bit of a longer break before we come back to open the floor up for even more questions on all kinds of topics.
Bwahaha!
No.
Ooh, one last thing
yeah.
before we go. If you haven't ordered your Gather hoodies and t-shirts yet, you
That's
can
super
also
important.
find them, and I'll be posting the link in our Discord and on our Facebook, and we'll post it everywhere.
Yeah, link spam.
Yeah, link spam it. We'll be shipping them this year because obviously we can't all collect them at Gather. So they're like a cool kind of exclusive that comes to you. And they'll be printed at the end of the month and they'll be shipped sometime in July. So you probably will get them by the end of July.
Oh, cool. We got a bunch of questions, so I think we should just keep going for a couple more
I want
minutes.
to answer the sacred space one real quick because there's the crystal one.
Yeah.
So the question is, can you make a stone or crystal your sacred space? I had, there was a house member, they were the original counselor case elder way back in the day, and they grabbed, I have this enormous garnet. Garnet is my birthstone. And they used that as their focus to create an inner temple inside the garnet matrix. And it was, it was pretty potent.
Yeah.
If there is an item, a physical focus that you can use it as the anchor for anything else that you are then building energetically. And then, the only limit is your ability to focus your intent into it. There's two other questions, so I'll let you field those.
Okay. So a question that's more about the physical space in which we create sacred spaces. If the space is for a community, how important is community input for the aesthetic design of the space?
I think it depends on what the space is intended for. And how flexible you want to be. If you have a certain structure that it's always this way and you come in and you're doing things and certain things need to be a focus for the work that you're doing, obviously it kind of it generates its own flavor of shape. But I think personally, I think it's more powerful when people feel ownership of that space in a community setting. So if people can give a little piece of something, then now they're a part of it. Down here with a lot of the altars that we have in New Orleans, for instance, it's encouraged that you leave an offering. You could almost twist that into leaving a piece of yourself, which is something that we do. We have an altar that we set up that we put a piece of ourselves on that altar. We are now, physically in some ways part of that space. We have generated that. We have impacted the space as well. So I think that that's a more powerful and potent way of creating communal sacred space, is to have people participate and actually give their own flavor to it.
Yeah. And I would say it will depend on the community. Some communities need, by the definition of the tradition and the practice, need more input, and others need more structure so that it's more dictated to them.
Yep.
And so your mileage will vary based on the tradition and the practice.
That's so interesting. So where I went with that question was actually the sacred space that is people's living space, because one of my other jobs is setting up people's homes for them to make sure that the energy flows well in the spaces they live in every day. And for that, oh dear, what's happening to my head? Well, and for that, the input of the other people is essential. My input is only important so insofar as I can give them ideas that might or might not work for them to set up their space in a way that facilitates the kind of energetic environment that they want. So, yeah, I mean, in that case, it's much less the person designing the sacred space who needs to even have input into it. It's really just how can I best support these other people in creating what they need? And I think that's a much, an often overlooked way of creating sacred spaces, is just making the spaces you live in something sacred.
Yeah.
I highly recommend.
And then there's a fun question about mandalas, and I'd almost lean towards sigils kind of folding sigils into that as well as like representations of space and intent. But because there's a question, does it have to be a Buddhist mandala, and are there different types that we can use? The fun thing, of course, is we've got a Buddhist in the group,
Yes.
like on their way to become Rinpoche. So not just random. I read a Buddhist book and now I'm going to say that I'm Buddhist. Like full on learned from lamas, not the sort that spit.
Yeah, not the sort that spit.
Wow.
I had a conversation with Kess specifically about that. That's why I included them. Is I would honestly, if you want to poke them to do that, to have that conversation, do it, because they are such a wealth of information, like so much information about it. But there's this really neat concept that the mandala is like its own representation of reality. It is also a temple. It is the being within it. It is the purpose. It is the journey. It is a multi-layered, beautiful way of representing the space. Does it need to be Tibetan? Nope. Doesn't have to be that flavor of Buddhism, but you can take those concepts and generate your own design for that intended purpose. And that's why I bring it up, because you can use something as simple as a picture on a wall in order to engage into a sacred space.
Oh, Elfie Music's dad, James Music, has paintings that are designed specifically for that. They are portals, gateways, and awakening devices. And they are pretty interesting. They integrate image, art, color, and sigil magic.
Cool. So I've got a question for me, even though technically this is your class, Abri.
Oh, what's that?
It's actually related to sacred space, and I have an answer for it. So the question is, if I would be willing to talk a little bit about what heralding was like in that opening ritual.
By all means, sweet darling.
Which was a fun thing, because nobody let me know beforehand that was
a very spontaneous ritual.
I know. But it was one of those funny moments, because I was like, I was sitting there, and I also knew that Zosh hadn't mentioned to Griff that Griff was going to be holding space there either. But I was like, I have a feeling that Zosh is going to pick me to herald. And then I was like, surely he won't. And then I was like, oh, look at that. He did. But it was fascinating, because there was actually a more physical awareness for me of being in a space. And while I didn't, the question also was about whether I was announcing guests as they entered the temple. I didn't have a sense of announcing, but I definitely had a sense of acknowledging. Like there was a distinct sense of like, there's some, like I couldn't put names to any of them, because it was just like like people. But I definitely was like, yeah, there's people going in, and I nod to each of you, even though like 17 of you have passed in that space of one nod. Like you have an astral nod from me.
Well, the funny thing to me is from my perspective, where like I'm here and there's like the big arc and there's the above, and then there was the arch, and Griff was on this side from my perspective, and you were on this side.
Oh yeah, I was.
And and Griff stood more stoically, kind of like literally holding open the space as the pillar, and you were like, yep, and just sort of like allowing people in, and And so,
if I visualized more arms, I would say that I had many arms in that case, because I knew like 2 of them were just up. I was like, hee, we're making an arch, hee. But there were also like other arms doing other things. And like, I was only paying attention to the 2 that were like, ha, 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 this is funny. Because I'm literally making an arch with my hands.
Well, and I forget exactly when in the process of Keprian ritual, the priests actually like started to talk to one another, what they were perceiving, and realized that there was a point where we were literally seeing in our minds the same thing. And the first couple of times it was like, did somebody like, drop a word? Was like, no, we're actually building a thing and collectively perceiving it. And that is how this is supposed to work.
Yep.
This is why there are traditions that are hundreds of years old that talk about astral temples, from the Freemasons, who are a couple hundred years old, like all the way back. Like there is a reality. I mean, the Tibetan Buddhists, especially with the palaces and the temples that they create with great intricacy.
Yes.
That it is conceptual and also real.
Yep.
And it can be perceived as an objective reality, which is just kind of mind-boggling.
I would encourage, so I remember you said not to discuss what we were perceived in that space.
Everybody's been sharing it. So
Okay, fine.
Yeah,
Okay, as long as they're sharing it, because like I was gonna say, like if you have the opportunity, you haven't yet, because I haven't yet, to go and like draw or paint, like try and represent it in a way, even if it's writing it down in detail, so you can share it and see what people got, because you will be surprised at the similarities when you start sharing space, especially like with our connection rituals, when people are coming into that space periodically, it strengthens it every time. Like you get a better sense of, I recognize this, but what's right over here. So you start like expanding your awareness of that space every time you enter it.
Well, getting the validation builds confidence.
Yes.
So that you can kind of leap over that internal hurdle that most of us have been trained with of, I'm imagining this, therefore it's all in my head, therefore I'm just making it up, and therefore it's not actually real. As opposed to, I'm imagining it, and my imagination is a potent tool through which I focus.
Yeah.
And I can use it to create imaginary things, or I can use it to create this powerful magic.
Yeah. I mean, working with energy bodies is very similar. Like you build that confidence back and forth as you start to like gain, like, yes, this feels right. This is what it feels like to create this. So
there was actually another question that feeds right into that, which is if any of us have tips on setting up non-physical spaces, if you're not good at visualizing, I would say that for me, visualizing actually only plays a tiny part in what I do. Most of it for me is just intending. Like I focus on will.
I've been trying to shift my language. I blame Shakti Gawain because of the creative visualization that I read like back when I was 17, 18. And so I use the word visualizing, but what I mean is it doesn't have to be visual. It's just intent. So building it with intent, as you say.
Yeah.
There's also, years ago I wrote an exercise that was basically creative non-visualization, where after
that's an awesome thing.
Well, basically, when you go down the list of like which of your senses is actually the one that appeals, or the ones that appeal most strongly to you, and then when you're trying to focus your intent through imaginative work, what you then do is try to appeal to the primary to you senses. Carl Jung called the same technique active imagination, and maybe that's a better word, but I avoid imagination at first because, again, most people in Western society have been kind of primed to think imagining means fake, means making up. And that really undermines this incredibly potent tool that we have.
Yeah. That is fantastic. There was one more question that I wanted to bring up before we skedaddle off to our mandatory break.
Persistent
yes, that was the one. Death. Thank you for seeing that. Okay, here it is. Do you find that any of your sacred spaces persist in dreams, and can they persist after death? Yes.
Yes.
I stumbled smack into James' music stuff after he had died. Oh, yes. And in my psychic dreamwalking book, like creating spaces like that as a meetup space for long distance work through trance and travel and dreamwalking is another potent application of creating these spaces.
Yeah. Oh, you have to be up here right now, don't you?
Hi, Dexter.
Everybody's saying hello to Dexter in the chat too. Hello.
He's very enthusiastic about being on my desk right now.
Yeah, well, that's where you're focusing your attention, and that's what he wants.
Oh, you want to come?
Is anybody else feeling overly energized? Yeah, probably. I had to like go and power eat a whole bunch of chocolate covered pretzels after running through opening ritual because I was buzzing.
You know what I keep failing to do
is eating.
Have an actual meal.
You should do that.
I've been snacking though. Healthy snacks. See, here's an empty wrapper.
Considering the idea of an actual meal is an energy bar and like a power drink, you're fine.
Yes, I am fine. I have the official word.
There has been sustenance.
Yeah.
So,
So one of the like good side effects, but also like probably unexpected if you're new to this, is even though we are communicating through this virtual space, we are connected. Like we are in a space together.
Just like Gather.
And it's just like Gather.
Super cool.
There's this intense exchange of energy. There is now this intensely energetic, rich environment. And if you're not used to that, it's going to feel really buzzy and kind of heady. You might feel a little bit like, maybe not dizzy, but like kind of bendy in the head. And if it gets too overwhelming, what I recommend, and we've gone over this a little bit, is just step away and like remove yourself from the space, the cognitive space, and do something completely different, something very physical. If there's like a taste or something that you like to eat, like just a little bit of something to like bring you back to your body, drink some water, run your hands under cold water, just kind of like bring yourself back.
Deep breathing.
Yeah, find your center again and just kind of shake it off a little bit.
Yep.
Some more coffee. Becoming the other recaffeinated.
Just start screaming.
Yep.
Ryan, somebody direct him to the HK, the forums over on Discord.
The forums
because there's some very intense chatter going on with that.
Yeah, the forums are linked on our Facebook group. Okay. You just have to scroll down to find it. We will try to post it at intervals. But you can also start or participate in discussions that are happening on the Facebook page. I think whatever platform you're most comfortable with, please go to it. Oh, yeah, go to it. Don't knock over the jars that you can't see. Great. All right. So yeah, we've got 20 minutes until we start up the open discussion and chat this evening with all of you. So make sure to move your body, drink some water.
Make sure this one eats something.
Eat
yes,
some
please.
food. Sorry.
You gonna say goodbye, Dexter?
Oh, bye, Dexter.
Yeah, you're such a good boy.
All right. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you in 20
Bye.
minutes if you're free. All right. Bye.
Bye.